what's the U.S. objective? What's the U.S. strategic game plan? What are the endpoints? It's a dot that keeps jumping around. And similarly, from the Iranian standpoint, we know that the leadership is divided. A super hardline faction within the IRGC is really making the military decisions. We don't.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Heroes Path Dispatch. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. 10 days ago, we left the negotiations in Muscat with a flicker of hope. Tonight, that diplomacy is dead. American aircraft are flying their 10th straight night of strikes on Iran. 3 American soldiers been killed. The Straits of Hormuz is effectively closed, and gas just crossed $4. And in the middle of it, the Senate did something it hasn't done in a generation. It said no to the defense bill. That's tonight. So the war, the revolt against the war, and the bill at your kitchen table. So it's the so what and the now what on every story. Jeff Steinberg, it's great to be with you.
Pleasure to be back, John.
Well, Jeff, let's walk this through with me, if you would. 5 quick ones. Let's talk first about Lindsey Graham, if we could. He was born in 1955, and he just passed away.
Quite suddenly, and it occurred immediately upon his return from a visit to Kiev. And I spoke a few days ago with someone who was fairly close to Lindsey and basically said that in very recent conversations, he had expressed concern that the whole U.S.-Iran war was leading nowhere, that it was a trap that the United States was having a hard time finding a way out of. So while everybody thinks of Senator Graham as part of the most strong pro-war faction within the Senate, someone extraordinarily influential with 24/7 access to President Trump, he was having deep and growing concerns that there was no clear path forward or way out of the Iran war. And of course, his sudden death creates a vacuum because he was one of the people who could get on the phone with President Trump on a moment's notice, undoubtedly had access to the president's private cell phone, didn't have to go through any of the screening bureaucracy, Susie Wiles or anybody else officially. And so we're waiting to see what the consequences are going to be where you've got razor-thin Republican majorities in the Senate and the House.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Kyiv. The Senate's answer was to rename that bill for him the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia Act bill that's now more than 60 sponsors. That's enough to break any filibuster. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started the episode, is that his sister Darlene was appointed to a seat and sworn in within days. And I believe this week his casket's going to be lying in state in the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah. The one thing I would say, I was very critical of Lindsey Graham from a lot of his enthusiastic support for the Iraq war back in 2003 and this Iran escapade. But I have to also say that he was part of a preciously small group of senators who were committed to defending the Constitution. There was a bipartisan group that would surface periodically people of very different ideological persuasions, but who were strictly committed to the constitutional separation of powers and the role of the Senate and the rules of the Senate. The Senate is permanently in session because every 2 years a third are turned over. And there's no Senate Rules Committee. There's very few rules, and it takes a lot of effort to change them. And so this grouping has tended historically to be defenders of the constitutional framework for the duties of the Senate. So in that sense, it's a more complex legacy than just simply his enthusiasm for war policies.
Well, you could say whatever you like about him, but he was an Air Force colonel. He's a military lawyer for 33 years.
Correct.
And for 3 decades, one of the loudest voices in Washington on behalf of those of us in uniforms.
Right.
I believe he was 71 years old. And so we wish his family the best. So Jeff, secondly, the World Cup. Spain wins the World Cup on American soil Sunday at MetLife Stadium in front of 80,000 people. Beats Argentina 1-0 in extra time to win the World Cup. So it's the first ever that was decided on American soil, I believe.
Yes. And also Spain in the entire finals only gave up 1 goal.
Yeah.
They were a strong team. And I think, again, the fact that more than a third of the games took place on U.S. soil, U.S., Canada, Mexico, it really gave a lot of foreign visitors a chance to see the real United United States, the decency of the American people. Similarly, it was a good reminder for Americans who've been inundated with anti-immigrant propaganda to see the goodness of the visitors and their enthusiasm for the hallmarks of the American way of life, even still to this day. It's trite, but Chick-fil-A, ranch dressing, big box stores, decent size homes and apartments, all of these things took a lot of foreign visitors by surprise because they had been so inundated with propaganda that every American was basically carrying around a gun or a switchblade and hunting down their neighbors. And so it was a very useful human-to-human experience that I think and I hope is going to resonate.
And what an exciting game, too. Ferran Torres
Tremendous.
Scored it. 19-year-old Lamine Yamal won the tournament.
Right.
And then 39-year-old Lionel Messi walked off the world stage for the last time.
Right, he's
The
retiring.
enduring image was Yamal crossing the field to console Messi. In the meantime, oh, by the way, you had smoke warnings and floods. The sky over New Jersey was finally clear and 80 degrees. So whatever else the country is arguing about, it threw the biggest sporting event on earth, and we pulled it off.
Exactly.
Wonderful, wonderful event. Let's talk about the floods in Texas. Again, almost exactly a year after the country floods killed more than 100 people, the same rivers rose again, didn't they?
Yeah, we have clearly a changing pattern of weather. We can debate endlessly whether human activity is the contributing cause or a contributing cause. There's people who argue that we're really dealing with much larger issues of planetary movements and things like that. But either way, we have enough of a database now to know that the weather patterns have changed, and we ought to be reevaluating the risk factors in failing to invest in critical infrastructure repairs and improvements. And so every one of these instances that we've seen could have been mitigated, maybe not prevented because it's natural disasters, but the impact on the population, on the infrastructure, all of these things, we're just basically taking a tremendous and really unconscionable risk by not putting the investments into infrastructure management and repair. Tax cuts, things like that, that may be a feel-good moment, especially for the wealthiest of Americans. These are some of the real-world consequences of not having sufficient funds available, because these are things that the private sector should not be expected to do. Government's job is to create an effective platform on which private industry can thrive and benefit. And we're underspending on that on a scale that's scandalous.
Well, that really is the through line to all of this, is that the weather is landing harder more often and in the same places. So it's either we face that fact or we don't, and right now we're not, obviously. Let's talk about the fourth topic, Jeff. Israel set its election date for October 27th, didn't they?
Mandatory. That was the absolute last possible date under Israeli law for the holding of elections. And so this past week, the Knesset went through a sort of a all-night binge of legislation. And so the Knesset is now basically dissolved pending the election. So you've got Netanyahu, effectively a lame duck prime minister with a lame duck cabinet, but with a period of several months with greater freedom to act. And clearly Netanyahu is more and more desperate to win the election and to remain in power or create enough of a military regional crisis that the elections can be delayed maybe indefinitely.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of dangerous moment.
Well, and for the next 3 months, every Israeli decision about Iran, Lebanon, and Gaza gets made by a government that's fighting for its life at home.
Precisely right.
And then meanwhile, Lebanon is tracking, actually moved. A sixth round of talks in Rome produced an agreement for a framework of Israeli withdrawal from the pilot zones. And so the Lebanese army began deploying into the first villages. And today, Lebanon's president met an American president at the White House for the first time in 17 years. So pretty dramatic.
I think that my one caveat on the whole negotiating process is that when the U.S. wanted to play a constructive role with several Arab governments in bringing an end to the Gaza war, we didn't just talk to the Israelis. The U.S. negotiators, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner met with the top political leadership of Hamas. So the idea that we're negotiating with the Lebanese government, but there's no discussion with Hezbollah, tells me that this is really simply an effort to put the Lebanese government in the completely untenable position of being deployed to disarm Hezbollah, which, remember, is not only the resistance movement in the south, it was an outcome of the Israeli invasions in the early 1980s, but they're heavily represented in the Lebanese parliament. Under the Lebanese constitution, you've got a Shia speaker of the parliament. Nabia Berri has been there forever, but he is part of the Shia community. And in effect, Hezbollah is a critical part of his constituent, probably a majority. So they're a political factor. They have members of the parliament. And to think that we can basically induce the Lebanese government, of which Hezbollah is a part within the parliamentary structure, to militarily move to disarm Hezbollah is a recipe for just a continuation of the status quo, except with more frequent outbursts of violence.
Well, Jeff, let's talk about the fifth issue, and that's Ebola. Right now, it's outpacing the response. The numbers from Eastern Congo have nearly doubled since we last spoke. 2,200 cases, and nearly 800 of them are dead. The head of the World Health Organization said that the outbreak is now outpacing the response. More than 80% of the infections are now appearing outside all the known contact lists, which means that the trackers have basically lost the trail.
Yeah, it basically tells me that, again, we've underinvested in the kind of surge capability that's required to contain this outbreak. If you go back and look over the last 5-10 years, with the exception of COVID-19, which spread as a global pandemic, the outbreaks of Ebola and other deadly strains in Africa, up until this current situation, were relatively effectively contained, precisely because we deployed the necessary personnel, the public health measures, we did the tracking. And so this thing, I'm afraid, the barn door's open, and this is out of control. And we may be looking back 6 months from now at an Ebola outbreak that's extended outside of Africa.
Right. Well, and I'll say there's one real piece of good news, and that is that Uganda discharged its last patient and started the 42-day clock toward being declared Ebola free. But I really think that all of us need to watch this one with clear eyes, not with panic, because it's still an ocean away, but, fastest growing ever has never stopped being true. And so it should be concerning for all of us. Let's talk, Jeff, about the 24 hours from talks to strikes on the mediator. So it collapsed in Iran. The truce there collapsed almost immediately. Saturday, the 11th, right after we spoke, the delegation, they were talking in Muscat, and then Iran never met the American deadline to publicly renounce the attacks on shipping. And then on Sunday, the 12th, less than a day later, Revolutionary Guard forces struck Oman itself, who was the mediator. Missiles, drones on the port of Duqm and then Musandam Peninsula. And then the Guards Navy formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Where is this leading us?
Well, we've been discussing all along that this is a situation that very much defies an easy solution. I think it's notable that on June 17th, the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 60-day extension of the ceasefire, meaning that they recognized that the negotiating track itself was going to take more time to really dig in and work through the issues, and technical talks are still going on between the U.S. and the Iranians over some of the itemized details within that 14-point MOU, even though the MOU is for all practical purposes been abandoned. But what's the U.S. objective? What's the U.S. strategic game plan? What are the endpoints? It's a dot that keeps jumping around. And similarly, from the Iranian standpoint, we know that the leadership is divided. A super hardline faction within the IRGC is really making the military decisions. We don't know really the physical state of the new supreme leader. There's an elected government. Pezeshkian was elected president by a 9% majority. He was supported by the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And it's not clear that either side has a clear point objective and planned exit strategy at that point. I'm afraid that we're in a kind of a sleepwalking process where the kinetic targeting is clear, where more and more military analysts are pointing out that we don't have the reserve inventory of the missile defense systems, cruise missiles, other things that we've been for the last 9 nights deploying, again, at a fairly serious clip. There's been attempted updated mediation. The Pakistanis are meeting with the Iranians today in Islamabad. There's a high-level Iranian delegation there, and Pakistan is looking for pathways to resume the diplomacy. But right now, both the U.S. and Iran have accepted the idea that diplomacy and warfighting are going on side by side.
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger did that in Vietnam, and it kept going on for years. So I'm afraid we may be looking at that kind of a prolonged conflict until one or both sides simply get exhausted. We're running out the clock on energy reserves globally, and the Iranians are running out the clock on when the population is going to get so fed up economically that you get another round of serious protests.
Well, also, Jeff, you look at what the Iranian strategy is, they're hitting our friends, right? They're hitting Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, tankers. So that's their strategy, is to widen this war into a regional conflict. And they're largely succeeding at that. But here's the part that I think that all of us should receive standing still, and that is that we've had 2 of our American service members who were killed. And then days later, there was a soldier in Iraq who was killed by a downed Iranian drone. So that's serious. What's not being widely reported is that several hundred American troops have been injured during the last 2 weeks. We don't know what that number is because they're not releasing those figures. But thankfully, as I understand it, a lot of those injured troops are being returned to duty. At the very least, that's a knock on the door, and the tensions continue to ratchet up.
Also, I think it's notable that most of the air assets that the U.S. has in the region are being relocated to Jordan, where there's a sense of greater security. Secretary of War Hegseth came out today with a price tag that the war up until this moment has cost American taxpayers $37 billion. That's the direct and immediate costs of the war, the expending of the military equipment, the deployment of personnel and that. But that's really a fragment of the total real costs. If you look at the inflation factor and all of the other things that have been the consequence of the shutdown of the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, well, then let's take Washington and this past week next to it, because they're telling the same story. On Monday, the 13th, the president formally notified Congress of the renewed strikes, and that, I guess, has restarted the 60-day war powers clock, which is kind of crazy to me, because how can you start a war and then stop it and then start it again and have the clock restarting? But that's the way that they're trying to explain this. But I think it was 50 to 46. Every present Democrat voted no against a $0.5 trillion bill. The down payment on the $1 trillion defense plan that we've covered 3 episodes ago, plus this $67 billion supplemental for this war that you just mentioned. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about what's happening in Washington right now, because it is pretty dramatic by any measure.
Before there can be a vote, in this case on the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, they have to establish the rules for the vote. And the Rules Committee set up a procedure for closing debate so that they could proceed immediately to vote up that $1.15 trillion. And then there's a whole separate question of that $350 billion and the $66 billion piled on top. And as you said, all of the Democrats plus a number of Republicans voted against ending the debate. At the last minute, the Senate Majority Leader voted with the majority against proceeding to debate, which under the arcane Senate rules means that he can reintroduce for a new vote. But they're going to have to do a bunch of changes. You've got the issue of $350 billion in reconciliation, meaning the money's got to come out of other budget lines. Mm-hmm. You've got the costs of the war. You've got the issue you just raised, the 60 days. Can you really turn the clock off and start it again? There's been no consultation with the Congress, no voice of Congress authorizing the continuation of the war. And then there's the issue we've also talked about, which is integrating Israel fully into our national security and defense industrial base. There's growing opposition, increasing opposition to that, including from a number of members of the House and the Senate who've previously been staunch allies of Israel, but who dislike what Netanyahu's doing and see this as a breach of U.S. national security. So there's 3 or 4 different issues that different groupings find objectionable. And so there's going to have to be a lot more work done and probably a bunch of rewriting and compromise. Ultimately, they have to pass the bill for that defense budget, whatever the ultimate number is.
It really is unprecedented, though, because
totally correct. Yes.
The annual defense bill has passed every year since 1961.
Right, exactly.
I mean, here we are 65 years later. It's the thing that both parties know. One poll this week put public disapproval of this war at nearly 70%.
Right.
The man who might have brokered a way through, Lindsey Graham, died the day before the notification landed. So war is finally forced the question that the Constitution has always assigned to Congress, and that is who decides.
Exactly right.
So
exactly. I think that's in the minds of an increasing number of elected officials, members of the House and Senate, that so much power vested in the Congress has been turned over to the executive branch, and that the second Trump administration is ravenously and openly trying to grab ever more of it. And some Republicans are worried that there'll be payback time if the Democrats win the next presidential election or even the one after that. Those precedents for greater presidential power, the unitary executive, and the diminished authority of Congress is going to come back with a vengeance. Yeah. So I think that, as you say, the constitutional issues are in the forefront now, and that's not a bad thing on our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, well, that pendulum tends to swing, especially when you're facing an imperial presidency, which we are right now. So,
exactly.
Jeff, tell me why you believe this is the listener's story, not just a Washington story, because I think that's what's really important for anybody listening to this. They're saying, okay, why does it matter to me?
Number one, you mentioned that gasoline prices are now back over $4 a barrel.
Yeah.
Fertilizer deliveries have been dramatically scaled back. We're going to feel that later in the year when the poor fertilizer availability for the spring planting that's already happened starts to play out with shorter and lower crop in the fall during the harvest period. Mm-hmm. And the Federal Reserve is meeting next week, their open market committee. And there was last week an announcement of a slight reduction in inflation, but that was based on that gap period when the MOU was in force and oil prices were going down. Now they're back up again. Yeah. So the inflation pendulum itself is swinging back towards an increase. And of course, every American's right to vote, right to citizenship is framed on the idea that the Constitution continues to be a living and breathing document. And so in a certain sense, there's the material household issues, which are always ever present, prominent for good reason in people's minds. But there's also the issue that everyone is a voter, a citizen of a republic that was framed 250 years ago, and then further on by the Constitution itself. And it's in everybody's interest that survives.
Yeah. Because it really, truly, Jeff, because we all know that wars widen fastest when everybody's domestic politics reward escalation. But the constitutional question is now live in a way that I don't think we've seen it since 2002. Whether you think this war is necessary or reckless, if you're sending your sons and daughters into war, the people in Congress aren't worrying about that. But people here on Main Street USA are. And so that's another stake that we all have into it. And it adds on to the whole complexity of the 60-day war powers clock that expires now in mid-September. So every listener, whatever their politics, has a stake in making their 2 senators and 1 representative go on the record. That's not partisanship, it's the design. And we should all be following that, I think.
Yeah, I agree completely.
So Jeff, let's wind this up. You mentioned inflation. There's other things there too. There's a tariff switchover that's going to be taking place in Brazil, and that's pretty complex. We won't get into that here, but it's not the rosy picture that you would like for it to believe. But there is a bottom line for our kitchen tables. We're wherever you happen to be listening to that. And that is electronics, appliances, a car that's heavy on foreign parts. The honest math says the price is likelier to rise than fall this quarter.
Right.
But I think that we just have to stay tuned on that. So, Jeff, what would you say are the three things to watch in this week ahead?
Well, as I say, the Federal Open Market Committee is meeting on the 28th and 29th. Secondly, members of the House and Senate are looking for the exit because it's an election year and we're only a few days away from House and Senate recess for the August period. And when they come back, they're going to be even more anxious to wrap up business very fast and get out the door for the final month of campaigning.
Well, on that topic, Jeff, too, you've got a block defense bill. That's one of the unfinished businesses.
Exactly.
You got a sanctions bill with votes, but no vote. And
right.
Then you have an attorney general nomination that's hanging on 2 senators, and then this war powers clock. So they've got a lot of work left to do.
Right. And I think we've got to keep in mind every week to look closely at what's going on in Israel from the standpoint of Netanyahu's desperation and the opportunity afforded by this resumption of this sort of low-intensity asymmetric warfare that could blow up into a larger regional war on very short notice.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, Jeff, let's close there. This week, the war became a story about 3 American families and about an old promise that the decisions to send our children to war never belong to one person. That test isn't in Tehran, it's in Washington, and every inbox
right.
where citizens' representatives answer. So, Jeff, thank you to everybody listening.
Always.
Yeah. And by the way, right after this, we're going to have you present a webinar on the untold story of U.S. intelligence. So we look forward to that. But to everybody listening, hold your people close, watch the sign at the corner, and make your voice heard. I'm Colonel John Fensel. Thank you for walking the path. Bye now.